Well, another episode of Finding the Frothers. Don't know why I said well there. Welcome to the, maybe I was trying to say welcome. Welcome to Finding the Frothers. Matt Kendall, dear friend of mine.
Hey, Benny. Hey, everyone.
Hey, everyone. We were just talking about what are we going to riff on? What's the plans? And I just got back from a really good surf, actually. Social distancing, of course. But Matty kind of just had a couple of back-to-back meetings on the Zoom. So I think there's some emergent things around, Zoom fatigue. So what we want to do is have free-flowing conversations and not go back to back, I think. So we want to give each other a little bit of space in this. So I'm just going to give you an opportunity, Matty. What are you frothing on at the moment? What's got you buzzed?
I guess seeing people, I suppose, rediscover a new way of working, or just even discovering a new way of working, and realizing that it is possible. And I think, we've all seen what's been happening with the government. We were talking about, climate change. It wasn't possible to do these things. It wasn't possible to sort of stop the flights. It wasn't possible to find the money for these kind of programs. And now we're all witnessing the government, out of thin air, sort of materialize this money. Because most of it, don't even have to print it anymore. It's digital, and they're making what needs to happen. And I think that is happening for a lot of organizations. And as somebody who's worked with organizations, whether it be sort of large, small, or even sort of government organizations around digital transformation, it's been amazing. This, instead of this 2-year project of protracted planning, literally organizations in a matter of weeks have had to digitally transform. And some of them are doing it well, some are doing it. I'm really struggling. And some of the organizations that are struggling quite often has to do with security, and that is a very real sort of difficult hurdle to come over if they're dealing with sensitive data and materials. But some of them it's just cultural, and some of them are really command and control. Some of these managers and bosses need to sort of walk around and see that their people are at their workstations, keystroke by keystroke, tapping things away. And I think what's happening is people are recognizing that you don't have to commute 2 hours a day in order to feel like you're part of a group or you're part of a team. You don't need to be sitting in the same room to collaborate. And, this is something I've known from the get-go, starting my business 4 years ago. And, I've worked with people that started way before that. And in fact, I wrote an article called, it was my background is advertising, but it was a bit of an MVP, and minimum viable product. I just wanted to put this blog post out there and see what the response was. And it was called "The Agency of the Future is Not an Agency." And it was a play on words in the sense that, the future of the agency is you as a worker having your own agency in as far as who you work with, where you work, who you work for. And I put it out there, and the fact that, maybe, in a world where that is constantly, it is complex and has different channels and different requirements at any given time, maybe an advertising agency working out of a warehouse in Surrey Hills isn't the best solution. Anyway, I put that out there, and 100,000 reads later, it pretty much gone viral, and that was enough for me to start my business. And pretty much for the last 4 years, I have been working remotely, and it's worked great. We've got people dotted up and down the coast. Reunion, who we work with, us working together. You're in the Goldie, I'm in Mullum. Sarah and Seb are currently, Seb's in Sydney, Sarah's currently in Newcastle, but that's constantly in flux, and we've been able to work with that ongoing. But there is, I suppose this is a massive adjustment, and just because it's happening and then people are discovering it and discovering that they can do it, there are struggles, there are challenges. And I saw a great post on Twitter where somebody said, actually, we're not working from home. We are in lockdown dealing with a crisis while trying to work from home. And if you're a parent, which I can attest to, having a child to deal with and I've got a young child that needs constant supervision. She's actually now just swinging out there with off the gymnastic rings right next to me. But I've got friends who are trying to homeschool 3 kids. I mean, doing that while holding down your your job is really challenging at times. So it's not seamless. There are these sort of different stages of where people are at on this, and there are people that are digital natives or remote workers or digital nomads, distributed teams such as what we're talking about that are really super comfortable with it. And there hasn't been much of an adjustment for us. It's just that we're unable to go outside as much. But for a lot of people, I imagine it would be quite a larger adjustment.
Yeah, totally. Like I even remember when I quit my full-time tech job, being in everyone's face, sometimes 16 hours a day. And then all of a sudden just working by myself. It can be a lonely place. Like for someone who doesn't have kids, it can be super lonely. But that's the awesome thing about technology, especially if I've still got your job, but you can connect with people. And I think what we're going to learn to do is adapt and be better at having deep and meaningful conversations. And just through my work with 101 tokens and the drinking stuff, I've been getting messages of people saying, oh, I decided that I'm spending a token with someone via virtual who I haven't spoken to in 3 years. And I was like, and they'd taken the time to kind of think, okay, well, now this is the jam. Maybe I'm not going to go to the same pub I go to every Friday, which I can't anyway, with the same 2 blokes. I'm going to call that person that I had that wild time with when I was traveling in my teenage years or early 20s or whatever. And so I find that fascinating, is that we are adapting as we go. And I just want to touch on something based on you starting your agency Fromm, well, Agency of the Future, right? Because it's not a typical agency. I really loved, and I already knew this, but I really loved that you started it with a blog post. And I feel like what we were riffing on a little bit of before we went live was kind of people now have a little bit of extra space, potentially, as long as they don't have the kids, right? They have a little bit of extra space, maybe with their commute, or they don't have their boss hawking them. And so now's a really great opportunity to kind of explore maybe it's the rise of the artisan. I said that, I don't know how to say it probably, but maybe that's where it begins. Like when people just need to write a blog post, something simple like that, put out something that they've been thinking about for a long time, and you don't need 100,000 views. That's rad. That's super validation. But if you get a couple of people interested, then that's kind of the roll-on effect that potentially we could see the re-rise of the entrepreneurs, because we're all entrepreneurs 100 years ago, right? Maybe a bit longer. So yeah, what would you say to people about that kind of like prototyping that blog post or that video, that live video?
Yeah, I think I suppose it's sort of going back to that thing around stages, and I think that the elephant in the room in terms of context is that there are also a lot of people out there without jobs. Who are struggling, who are, and the money that the government has put aside, that's not necessarily going to end up in people's bank accounts for a long time. So, and I've just noticed that the statistics as of the time of recording this, I think there's 10 million Americans that are now out of work, which is really, really worrying. So there's a lot of people sort of going through that. And I think, that's going back to a lot of what Jamie talks about. It goes back to sort of making sure that you're okay, that, if you've got resources to make sure that you can have a roof over your head, that you're going to be fed. And if you haven't, you need to start reaching out to your connections in your network, in your community, and finding that. I think this isn't the conversation around that. There are government resources. There are lots of community support organisations that can help you with that. But just if you're in that space right now, then get going. You need to sort that. I guess then that next phase is then you've also got people where I would even put myself a little bit in this right now, where I don't have a lot of spare time right now. I'm actually sort of the busiest I've been, and I know there's a lot of people I know, once again, mostly with kids, who are really, really sort of busy, just trying to sort of keep, make sure that the fridge and the pantry is stocked, and instead of keeping a house running and looking after kids. But then, there will be that gap, what you were sort of talking about, where people who are normally commuting, a lot of people, there's that whole notion of bullshit jobs, and I'm not saying that, that a lot of jobs out there are bullshit, but let's face it, we've all worked. A lot of our jobs have a bullshit element to it in that old model, and I think what you're alluding to is a lot of that's kind of being cut away, whether it's the commute, the unnecessary meetings, because a lot of the meetings are happening on Zoom now. Like, the whole thing is like, could this meeting have been an email? Like, we're talking about, Zoom burnout. At the moment, a lot of my life feels like professional chat roulette. It's just faces popping up on screens one after the other.
Minus the dicks.
Minus the dicks. Yeah. Well, that depends on your work, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
But I think, so people are, I think, being a bit sensitive around, we won't just call a meeting. It is people sort of editing on that. And I think that brings us into this space of hopefully, there's the personal element, which I'll get to, but then I think there's the organizational element, whereas before there was this kind of quantitative measurement of showing up and being there and actually sort of being at the right meetings, and possibly even sort of, wearing the right clothes, saying the right things. We've all been there. The guy that just had the charm, who could switch it on, rock in a little bit late, still have the leadership eating out of his hands, where his output really wasn't, much chop. And I think in this environment, it's really going to sort the wheat from the chaff, and it really is going to be about output. And so I think a lot of people will thrive being able to, if you don't have the boss looking over your shoulder, being able to do some deep work without getting tapped on the shoulder every moment. So, and that was actually my blog post then talked about that, is that with that spare space, I sort of saying you can surf a bit more, you can do a bit more yoga. This is, given the lockdown component of what we're doing, that is restricted. But I think, that thing that interests you, that passion that you've always loved, or that thing you would love to explore but you've never had time for, now's the time. And I think, explore it without a goal. Do a blog post, read up on it, do a blog post, do a video on it, get it out there, get some feedback, be humble about it. Just kind of say, look, this is something I'm exploring right now. I'd really love, if anybody is an expert on this, I'd really love your feedback on my take. But at the same time, just grow into it and really create the space for it. And I think, there's some, one of the things I'm looking forward to, if and when I finally do get a bit of time, is, John Vervaeke's meaning crisis. I mean, he's just got hours and hours. It's almost like a university course. And it's something that for me has led us almost to this crisis that it's part of the crisis that we're having now. It's one of the reasons why we don't have anti-fragile systems that can adjust and look after the people that need to be looked after really, really quickly. But I digress. I think it is now is the time. We're getting our veggie patch sorted. We've got some chooks in for our daughter. We're making sure that we're spending a lot of family time and making time for our daughter to find some joy in each day. It's fast tracked for me. For me, one of the reasons, starting from and reunion has been sort of part of this sort of gradual adjustment for me away from the game the normal way of existing, which I realized was broken and wasn't sustainable. And they've all been sort of steps. And, we moved up here was another big step. And we were well on our way to sort of, in our little place here in Mullen, got a nice large block where we can put chooks and veggie patch. The next was to get, be self-sufficient with water tanks, solar and batteries. And we haven't, this crisis happened I knew it was kind of coming down the pipe in terms of something, in terms of either a big economic shock. I didn't pick pandemic. I have to admit that wasn't on my list, but climate shocks, as we've had in Australia, where we just drought, boom, fires, boom, floods, boom. And, you know, on my phone, I had on my front page, I had fires near me app, closely followed by floods near me app. And so it was already sort of happening. But I kind of thought I had a bit of time. So for me, it is kind of now prioritizing. It's got some urgency, but then it's really focused us on. And Jamie Will's got some great resources on how to prioritize the things that you need in his Flow Genome project around resilience and through a survival lens. But in terms of personal growth, if you do have that time, yeah, man, now is the time to make hay and try different things. If you one of those people where it's just like, oh, there's too many things I'd like to try, well then just sort of cycle through them, and maybe you'll end up then with an ecology of practice, which you can then take into our post-COVID reality out the other side.
Post-COVID reality, I like that. Although, yeah, I think the problem is that, well, potential problem is that people are just hanging out to go back to regular, and hopefully this kind of shake up would be a little bit of a, hey, you know what, we could try a few different things. And there's the plug for me is always talking about vice optimization. So like, if you say you have no time, is there anything that you're doing which is kind of shitty, like Netflix binges, for one, or anything that you put binge on the end of, that you can have a little bit of self-reflection time and then see if you can take back a bit of that quality time to do something a bit more interesting. And I think it's great point. You know, it's hit us a little earlier than what we said. I think all the smartest minds that we follow and that we associate ourselves with have all said that in one way or another, that it's come a little earlier than what we thought. So everyone's not going, oh my God, you know, this has been coming for a long time. And that's why you just mentioned ecology of practice. This is potentially just the jab before the uppercut, the little jab. This, you know, you were throwing punches before. This could potentially just be another jab, and we don't know what the uppercut is. So now if we are thinking about this extra space, where are we finding flow, joy, getting chooks in? What can we do now? So we've got, like you mentioned, an ecology of practice that keeps us in alignment as best possible, given whatever the context is at the time. And I'd love to hear from you, because ecology of practice is very important. I guess for the most part, we're talking about what are our daily routines, our habits, our rituals, etc. But a big part of that, and a big part of the overall ecosystem and the work that we're doing with Reunion, and in particular our program Rise Up, is and where you really, I guess, come to the fore and give such an invaluable part of the puzzle. It's our ecology of information. So some people, that might be like the gnarliest term they've ever heard. They've never really thought of that as a thing. Can you give us a little bit of an explanation as to what an ecology of information is?
Yeah, well, it's you know, we're humans, and as humans, we're the top of the food chain, and one of the reasons we're top of the food chain is not just the opposable thumb and being able to make tools. It's just the fact that we were able to work together, we were able to collaborate, and the key tool to that, of technology, or you know, psychotechnology, as John Beveke calls it, you know, was narrative, and whether it was you know, early sort of mysticism and shamanism through to philosophy and religion, it was able to, you know, we're able to sort of tell each other stories, and when a story has enough salience between enough people, it becomes an accepted truth. And so that is really how we make sense of the world. It's how it helps us perceive it, it helps us make sense of it, and then it helps us then make the decisions we need to make in order to live our lives. And that has obviously experienced some rapid change over the last while, and to the extent that there is, you know, what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls a broken information ecology. And I think we'd all agree with that. And that led to sort of, you know, particularly in Australia and America, some really profound polarization with deep partisan bias quite often in a lot of sources. And something that we go through in the Rise Up course is, you know, there is, you know, when you're sort of looking at the information, this is the information you're receiving in terms of media. So social media, publishers, news sites, newspapers. There's a sort of an X and Y axis, and there's quality, there's high quality and low quality, and then there's left leaning and right leaning. And you know, it's something that we go through. It's just, you know, when you're looking at at the information that you're receiving, to understand where that information is coming from. Is it a trusted source? How partisan is it? You know, if it's high quality and centre left, well then, you know, that's something that you know, you can certainly take on board. But maybe what's a high quality centre right take on the same issue? And it's very
Can you just quickly explain like left and right in general terms?
Yeah, so in general terms, I mean, it's on the political spectrum, you know, you've got One Nation on the far right. You've got the Liberals, who used to be centre right. In recent years, you know, sort of maybe Malcolm was a bit sort of centre right, but you know, you've got a lot of more authority. Or if this is for Australian audiences, Australia, definitely the Liberals are now more sort of very sort of religious and conservative, and a bit more sort of authoritarian. So they're more far right. You got Labor, which is sort of actually becoming sort of more and more centre left, and is almost kind of dead centre at the moment. And then you got Greens, which is sort of more over on the left. And then you've got high quality journalism. So, you know, you've got things like the Saturday paper. You've got, you know, the monthly ABC. They're kind of centre left. You've got the Australian, and this is really interesting on the graph that we use in Rise Up. You've got the Australian and the Guardian. So their news, just their straight out news, is deemed to be probably sort of high quality centre left for the Guardian and high quality centre right for the Australian. But then in their opinion, that they drop in both quality and they move more out to the extremes. So more out in the extreme on the right and more out on the extreme on the left. So I think that there's that on media. But then what has been really interesting in this current corona crisis is seeing the failings and also in some ways, you know, some of this consolidation that's really sort of happened in this crisis around both mainstream media and on social media. I've found Facebook to be a mess around this, and it's mainly because it's your friends. You know, your weird mate from high school who's now a QAnon conspiracy theorist, sort of, you know, sharing sort of memes about how it's a bioweapon, when clearly the science around the genetics has shown that it hasn't been, that it isn't a bioweapon. It's you know, having those kind of themes kind of come in it's always good to sort of ask, you know, where did you get this from? Where did you find this? What source? And what I'm sort of seeing is that even the mainstream media is quite often taking the government at its word, and the government is quite often being wrong at this. You know, we've seen the chief medical officer be a couple of weeks behind Norman Swan, who is the chief sort of the medical expert at the ABC, who's become basically, you know, our fire chief. Who was, you know, the various fire chiefs who just became that sort of central gospel for us during the fires. Norman Swan has been that. And, you know, as a communications strategist and analyst, I'm always looking at patterns in terms of who has been more consistently right over time. And Norman has been much more right than our own sort of chief medical officer. And so that's what the government that's been the government line. So the government line, which should be trusted, is not necessarily as accurate as the ABC, as the ABC has been. And then even more so, the sense-making component of Twitter that I've been on has been absolutely phenomenal. And yes, there was a lot of misinformation on there during the bushfires. There was a lot of bots. There was a lot of trolls, a lot of trolling going on. And yes, that is still there. But if you can curate and follow the right people, Twitter has been an incredible sense-making tool for this, because essentially you've got some of the smartest people in the world. With this channel, it's almost like everybody has been working on this. Everybody has been crunching the data. And, you know, it's almost this kind of like crowdsourcing, and people are just putting stuff out there going, this is what I've found, what do you think? And then somebody else is passing what they've done. And it's really difficult. You know, even the raw data we're receiving is not necessarily accurate. You know, the death numbers aren't necessarily accurate, because there's some people are saying that the actual deaths from COVID in Italy could be double what they are, because some of these deaths are either, you know, they didn't necessarily die from complications of COVID, but the COVID made it worse, or people died because they couldn't get into an ICU bed because they were taking up with so many people sick from the disease. There's interesting things coming out around China around how the uptick in urns, cremation urns, is outstripping what the official government line is from China around people that died from it. So even those graphs that we're looking at, which is official data, may not necessarily be accurate. So that's where somewhere like Twitter just becomes this incredible crowdsourcing kind of filter for working out what is going on. And you know, the other thing is, off the back of that, is to switch off from it, you know, because that gets a bit addictive. And it's something that bringing it all back to your vice optimization, is that, you know, really bad soil, if it's saturated, you know, you've got to have a mixture of nutrients and air and bugs and bacteria and compost in there. You've got to have a right balance of everything so that a plant can thrive. If you're just on Twitter, you know, hitting for the latest news, you know, that becomes then a vice, and it becomes problematic, and you're basically saturating your own information ecology. You need to be going out there and giving yourself a break. You need to be spending time with people. You need to be having conversations with people about this kind of stuff. You don't want to be bouncing it around inside your head. You want to find people, like-minded people, who are looking up on this thing, and, you know, what sources have they been looking at, and what have they discovered? You know, get on Zoom, have a Friday drinks, and sort of talk about this, but then make sure you do end up talking about something else. Really focus on a couple of trusted sources. Maybe check into, listen to 7 a.m. on the morning. The 7 a.m. podcast is amazing. It's literally 10, 12 minutes, and they've got a journalist that's sort of focusing on one point. The Daily, which is very American focus, similar. I think 7 a.m. sort of borrowed the model off it, but they're basically, you know, they're all doing Corona stuff at the moment. But they're really short snippets. The Daily is from the New York Times podcast. And it's like a half an hour deep dive onto a topic where they're speaking to a journalist or an expert or a scientist. But at the same time, yeah, man, like we were joking yesterday about, you know, it is hard to find Corona-free content at the moment, that it's actually spread faster through our information ecology than it has throughout our communities. And so I'd like to sort of then bring that back to you and into the information ecology. And I think, you know, we are needing some new rituals now to deal with this. And, you know, you sort of mentioned that it's something that I'm sort of mindful of. Like I've mentioned that my vice optimization of sort of my whiskey nightcap has gotten a bit bigger over the last couple of weeks. But it is, you know, I'm still keeping a lid on it and keeping it to that. I am allowing myself a Netflix, but you know, 1, maybe 2 episodes max every now and then, just to sort of as a bit of a cleanser from, you know, just to give myself a bit of a mental break. Exercise is a good one. You know, from your perspective and ecology of practice, as somebody who has had sort of fairly well-defined rituals and quite a lot of them outdoors, how have you adjusted your ecology of practice and also your ecology of information in the last couple of weeks, because it's been a mass, even for us where, like we said, there hasn't been as much of a shift as it's been for others. It has still been an absolutely massive shift for everybody.
Yeah, I think, and this is what I've been talking a little bit about lately, is like, if you've already got some good rituals that you can adapt, just keep doing them. Because like Jamie talks about, it's like keeping you in line. So when the shit hits the fan, you get, the hitting the ground isn't as hard. You can land a bit softer. So yeah, starting with just the stuff that I already do daily, that hasn't changed a lot yet, because we're not like, I've got some clients in the UK and they're like, can go out once a day. It's this odd sort of vibe. And the US, people aren't even allowed out at all in some places. So it's literally starting from where you're at. With my information ecology, I'm tending just to listen to people like yourself, who I wholly trust. And just because I totally trust you doesn't mean that I take every word that you say as whole truth, which is a really interesting point for people to think about. Because I think, especially maybe my parents' generation a little bit, were trusting a lot in the news that was on the TV back in the day, because they were the only sources pre-internet, right? And there's still a hangover of that we just trust what the news readers are saying. And like you're saying, maybe now it feels like the information's getting a little bit better, but it's still behind the 8 ball. So yeah, my information ecology is literally, it was funny. I went to listen to a podcast yesterday and I went, oh, you know what you can do? Here's a hack. Just scroll back 2 weeks or a month and just go listen to a podcast there from your favorite podcasters, because they're probably not talking about it just yet, or it's only a little reference. And pending what the role of that plays, so that phone, that app that has the podcast on it, it's like you just said with your Netflix, is the role of Netflix for me to learn about coronavirus or learn about adapting my business or whatever through a documentary, or is it for me just to disconnect? And if it's just to disconnect, if it's just to not disconnect, I think disconnect sucks. I think change the channel is a better metaphor for it. So yeah, just to change the channel, switch into that recovery mode. Then a podcast, like I was listening to Future Thinkers with Derek Sivers, which Derek Sivers is one of my favorite thinkers. And they were just talking about the stuff that, because I love Future Thinkers podcast and I love Derek Sivers' mind. So those collaboration, they didn't talk about anything to do. It was a very positive, happy podcast, and vibes. So if you need a bit of we're always talking about like upregulation and downregulations of state. So if you're feeling flat and shit, don't listen to COVID. Don't go and seek out death statistics. Like, fuck, come on, like wake up, not to overuse that term. Listen to a podcast from your favorite people. Read some poetry from your favorite poet. Listen to nostalgic music that is positive. I tripped up the other day and started listening to some punk rock emo music from when I was a teenager, and I was feeling a little bit bad, and it probably made me feel worse. But find the nostalgia that are like upbeat. Listen to some Phoenix or something. And so they're kind of like these adaptable practices that I've dropped in. But the fun thing is that, and I get a massive kick out of shifting my habits and my rituals, because I get super bored super quick. So this kind of like rapid adaptability has been good, but just in my personal relationship with my partner, Jackie, we've had a real rough, especially last week, more so, a real rough week, because she's still at work because they haven't shut the schools and essential services and stuff. And then I'm at home going like, I'm social isolated, like you're not, and you're out there. Like, what's the point in me being social? So there's tensions that arise that aren't normally there. But what we've found is that you just have to go back to open conversations, and the practices, the ecology of practice around open conversations with your loved ones is more important than ever. So that's been a big one. But I'd like to throw a question back to you around, so say you're someone who this is the first time I've heard of ecology of information, and maybe I have been just watching a current affair, and probably they're not listening to this, but I give my listeners more credit. But maybe you have just been a little bit narrow focused and just believing the hype of everything for a long time, listening to way too many Instagram fucking influencers who have no idea about science, but spout and then don't give, like you were saying before, references, which invalidates a lot of things that I hear straight off the bat. If there's no at least hat tip to that this is coming from a reliable source, how would someone go about carving a new information ecology? That's the question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Benny. And I mean, that is also a very difficult one, because it's almost like a like a map of interests as well. And it depends, on, if it is about I imagine you're looking at through the framing of what is going on in the world, rather than just kind of your interests and whatnot. It's like the big important stuff. And I think it is important. I've had sort of friends to me sort of say, Matt, why are you worrying about what's going on in America? It's different over there, and we're in Australia, and it's so far away. And I'm like, yeah, dude, no, what happens in America has a massive ripple effect with us. And, I think, and I think that happened for me in 9/11. I was just a party kid in the 90s, and, sort of traveling around the world, and, just kind of, pretty go free and happy and go lucky. And then 9/11 happened, and that was a very important switch for me. And that was where I really started to, get interested in geopolitics, and got in sort of followed a lot of bloggers very early on, of which say Sam Harris quite early on in the piece, and he sort of really early on in his career, I sort of discovered him there. And a lot of these kind of emergent thinkers back then emerged out of that. And I think it's important to understand what is going on. Like, you cannot affect it. I think this is the balance. You can obsess yourself and fill your mind up with all this kind of information, which you can't actually affect on. But what you do want to have is enough information that you are knowledgeable, and where you do, like, for instance, the stuff that I'm really, really worried about American collapse. To put a Debbie Downer on it, but 10 million out of work kind of hit me in the solar plexus this morning. A little bit like the other morning, sort of seeing that basically our New South Wales government was going to fine us $11,000 or put us in jail for 6 months unless we were doing 16 pre-approved activities. And that for me was, once again, part of my information ecology is I'm a massive fan of sci-fi and dystopian films and novels. And I was like, wow, I feel I'm literally in one right now. At that. And so it helps frame the information of what's happening around you, if you've got that larger context of what it's happening in. And also understanding that, man, Australians are really, she'll be right, mate. The Australian she'll be right, mate is going to get us in trouble. So the government possibly does need, so it's looking at from to, like, wow, that's really dystopian. That freaks me out. But hold on a second. We saw what was happening at Bondi Beach. People weren't social distancing. Everyone's like, everybody's got a couple of relatives or friends go, oh yeah, mate, it's a beat up. So maybe we do need these draconian measures to flatten the curve. So what it does is it helps you look at any issue from different angles. And so my advice would be, is go for high quality journalism. The ABC, regardless of the flack that they get from the IPA and the right, they are high quality. They are quite, they might be left leaning, but they're quite centrist. Anything by Schwartz Media, such as the Monthly, the Saturday Paper, 7 a.m. I think I would read the Australian. I absolutely would read the Australian, because it gives you an understanding of what the other side of politics is thinking and saying. And they've got some excellent journalists on there, Peter Van Onselen and even just on the news. And they're struggling at the moment. There's a real issue with this. I made sure that I renewed my subscriptions, even though things are potentially going to be I have to tighten my belt. But advertising, all the papers are looking really thin. The Saturday Paper and those guys, their advertising was from the arts sector, and they're basically on hiatus until this is over. So they're asking for people to jump in, buy the paper, get a subscription, because journalists are getting furloughed or actually getting outright retrenched. And so we've got a parliament right now that has been suspended. And this has been weird for me. Like, there's been, Twitter's been up in arms. Hashtag Auspol is a good one to follow. There's lots of great sort of thinkers on there. Yes, it's a bit left leaning. But, you know, they're up in arms about it. But for some reason, not even the opposition has made much of a fuss about it. The media doesn't seem to be making much of a fuss about it. You know, on Insiders, there was no mention of it, which is the political discussion show last Sunday. So that's a bit of a weird one for me. I haven't made sense of that one yet. But, you know, we've essentially got a government now where our parliament has been suspended. We've set up Scott Morrison has set up a committee where essentially we've got the CEO of Fortescue Metals and a couple of good old boys pulling things together. And, you know, they've so far, you know, that the package that's come out for workers and childcare I've got to say, once again, you know, we've got to put our partisanship aside a little bit, and we've actually do have to get behind our government and hold him to account. But we've got to get behind Scott Morrison and our government, because if they fail, our society fails, and it's going to be that. We do not want that to happen. But at the same time, we want a strong opposition. We want a strong media ecosystem that is watching them like a hawk and holding them to account. And if we want that to happen, we need to support some of these media, high quality journalism, and high quality journalism, you know, costs money. So my advice would be, if you do have the money, like if things are really tight at the moment, don't go out there and get a 12-month subscription. But if you do have a bit of money lying around, it's actually not that expensive. Get a couple of good subscriptions, you know, from the Guardian, the Saturday Paper, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald,
Dumbo Feather,
Dumbo Feather, yeah. And I think that then goes out to, that's traditional. But then look at your podcasts. Look, you know, Future Thinkers, Rebel Wisdom podcast, or Rebel Wisdom are more of a YouTube channel, but they feed some of it onto a podcast, because that's a bit more meta. That's all just news and journalism and what very sort of focused locally. I would start looking into podcasts such as that, because you've got thinkers such as Daniel Schmachtenberger, Benita Roy, Jordan Greenhall, and now Jordan Hall. You know, I noticed Richard Bartlett is starting to sort of make a real sort of show on some of that as well. Some of these sort of thinkers that then help us make sense of what's going on, and so there's that helps us have that agency to then show up in this crisis. And Richard Bartlett is on Twitter is a really good follow as well, from Inspiral, and he's got a lot of, he was sort of saying, you know, one of the things around making an impact in this and is going out and finding a kindred community. And so that for me is probably it's never a complete jigsaw. It's never a complete piece. It's always in flux. But I think that's another really important aspect of the information ecology, is making sure you've got like a kindred community, a crew. And it was really interesting to hear him on the latest Rebel Wisdom talk about how, you know, he sort of has this kind of idea of a dialectic, which is the two people, and then a crew, which is like, you know, your larger crew, which is, we've always referred to each other in reunion as a crew. And then you've got a congregation, and a congregation is that Dunbar number of 100 or 200. And then beyond that, it's just a crowd. But I think making sure, and I think this is a time that if you're feeling really isolated, I'm sure you can think of some people that you really, you know, connected with, whether it was traveling or whether you lived in another city. Maybe you've moved to another city. I know I've done that a couple of times, and that can be really isolating, and you're probably feeling very isolated right now. I've even seen a lot of people talk about that, you know, even though they are isolated in a house and probably not living a very different life to the one they'd be living in their city, just spatially, just geographically, just in terms of, you know, sort of country and place, they're feeling really isolated. So now is an opportunity to connect them with them, whether it's via house party or Zoom or FaceTime, and make them part of your Kindred community. And that then becomes a really important part of your information ecology as well. Have regular catch-ups, whether it's, you know, tea parties, Friday drinks, whatever your jam is, dance parties, you know, get dressed up for it. There's a great meme I'm sort of seeing at the moment, which I think is a TikTok kind of leeching its way onto Twitter, with girls kind of, whether it's you know, girls from the Black community in America, or Palestinian girls, or the African fashion one was absolutely mind blowing, where they kind of throw the makeup brush to each other, and then they're there in their normal house clothes, you know, in lockdown, and then they sort of tap the screen with the brush, and then they're all sort of glammed up. Just riffing on stuff like that, like bringing play into it, you know, rather than just being what I'm doing now, throwing a party shirt like what you have, Benny, and sort of make it a bit of an occasion. And that really sort of then helps you. It's part of your information ecology. It becomes part of your ecology of practice, but then it's also kind of integral in how you're showing up in this new crisis that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, beautiful rundown. So many points I could just hook into there. But Richard from Inspiral, I don't know if it was him that said it, but he was interviewed on a podcast years ago, and one of his team, and basically the podcaster started banging on about their products that they were developing, and he was like, yeah, the products are good, but you know what is way better than the products? The fact that I get to turn up with a bunch of my mates every day and ask each other questions and inquire and you know, build stuff together. And that was like a catalyst moment for me. I was like, okay, all right, we can build epic stuff that the world needs, but before that, you need to look after yourself, like you just mentioned, but you need to find the people, find the frothers, that you can build it with. And if you're looking after yourself and you're hanging out with the right people, like we always say with Reunion when we have a fuck fest, which is a creative orgy of ideas, and if we hang out together, something will emerge. We'll figure out what the question, the problem is, something will emerge. So now more than ever, you've got an opportunity to maybe connect with someone where you thought, oh, I really found flow with that person, or I really found flow with the information that was coming from that particular media. Start to re-explore it. And I want to throw a hypothesis at you here. I might have solved one of your problems. So do you think that the Parliament shutting down, the reason that Labor have no problem with it and that the media aren't talking about it is because everyone's just fucking glad that they don't have to turn up and listen to adults yell at each other like children? Not even children. I think everyone's just like, oh, cool, that's fucking over. Maybe we don't have to do that anymore.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, all you have to do is watch Question Time. I mean, look, let me caveat this with, let's say I'm very grateful to have won the lottery, to be, you know, won the lottery, to have been born in Australia and to be living in Mullumbimby and all the privilege and fortune that comes with that. But I tell you what, man, we've got one of the worst examples of Westminster democracy, and when you sort of see it up there, it's just it reminds me. It literally reminds me. I went to a boys' private school. It reminds me of the banality of the bullies, that when you would see like sort of almost kind of two dickheads from your years just kind of facing off against one another, trying to spin. Remember that, you know, they'd try and spin the crowd off, you know, because everyone would be like, yeah, and then you'd try and spin it off you or off them, back onto the other person or just onto someone else. There's no sense making there. There's no collaboration going on. There is no co-design. And I check, I don't watch it, but I follow politicians on Twitter, and they post up videos, and I watch it, and it's just despicable. And it's just like hopefully, you know, we've been as many others are exploring new ways of governance, maybe off the back of this, because that just clearly doesn't work. Just having two teams shouting at one another when we've got the problems that we're dealing with are increasing complexity, and we've got this binary model of two people of like black and white, right and wrong, left and right, with absolutely zero nuance. And, you know, if that was the policy you took to the election, even if your realities change, you're going to implement it, even though the reality is completely different. And it is, my God, it is not the model for the world. And we've known that for such a long time. But what I'm hoping for is that this will be a reckoning where people will see how broken it was and is. And then people will go, oh, hold on a second, you can do this. You can pay for 100% childcare. You know, you can double New Start. You know, we can solve problems really quickly that are existential. We can just stop the status quo and introduce something new entirely, and tweak it on the fly based upon new information that we're receiving. So I hope that off the back of this, that there will be an intergenerational shift of power. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Daniel Schmachtenberger. It was this, and he kind of says, you know, this isn't an intergenerational thing, but, you know, okay, boomer didn't come out of nowhere. You know, it's literally, dude, you're in power, you're out of touch, back off. You know, like, and I think there is something in that, and we've felt this frustration that we've seen these people in power playing these old games that are just like, what are you talking about? The issues we're going to solve over here, and you're like, this is what you're focusing on. So there's a hope there, and I think, you know, once again, and I think this is, as we go into this, there is, and once again, Richard Bartlett sort of talks about we need a new framing, because there is every chance we'll go back to the new normal. I think, go back to normal, go back to the status quo. I think Scott Morrison was even quoted as saying that that's his goal. And man, he is our prime minister. So, and he's the one holding the power. He's got the one with the asymmetry of power. So he's going to want to just sort of bring it back, and we'll probably, you know, cut all sorts of essential services in order to pay for the bills. So, you know, Richard Bartlett talks to the same, as that we can't just reframe it as not going back to normal. We've been really bad, and even the climate movement has been really bad at articulating a vision for a better future. So I think that's where we've got to get busy. And we're in this kind of, I've seen a lot of models out there around different 3 stages that we're in at the moment. You know, a friend of ours, Alice, was talking about how through Theory U, we're in the triage stage. I've seen models around adapt or sort of react, which is what we're in now, then adapt and then build back better. Seen other ones, which is protect, pivot, and rebound. But there's also externally, in as far as what is happening outside of us, there is what we're in right now is, you know, we're in the crisis, and where it's super reactive. But very soon, I would probably say in a couple of weeks, we're going to then move into, like, you know, a Twilight Zone where we're still adjusting to this new reality. And this is a sort of a model that Chris Savage, is a comms expert, bit of a sort of a wizened elder in the comms industry. It's kind of using this model. And in this kind of Twilight Zone, you know, we're adjusting to life at home, and, you know, we're you know, recalibrating, you know, we've still got to make sure that granny's okay. We're still, you know, dealing with, you know, homeschooling and whatnot. But then we're going to start to move into the new dawn. And I think, you know, this is where we really do need to start to get busy. And that's, you know, Scott Morrison is saying 6 months. He hasn't released what the modelling is that he's got on that. It may well be longer, where we're still in lockdown. And, you know, there's going to be some really harsh realities of a lot of businesses going out of business. And so it's not all going to be, you know, tilling the veggie garden. A lot of people are okay now, may not be okay then, but still, hopefully the government response is sort of propping things up. But we're going to have to get busy, and we are going to have to, run fast and chew gum at the same time, and we're going to have to articulate a vision for the future, because we can't just say, what is the new normal? We can't just say this vague new normal. We saw where a vague approach got us in the last election, or got Labor in the last election. They did a lot of policy settings, but they didn't actually articulate the vision that we were moving into. They were just sort of saying that they would tackle climate change. We have to get really specific, and we have to. That's where I think, that's our approach with Reunion. Let's sort of bring everything together. Let's create a vision. Let's reimagine this. The machine that's been doing this to us and has been doing a lot of the damage is kind of being knocked offline for quite a while. And this is going to be our opportunity to imagine, and we don't have to just imagine it. We have to articulate and design it, this regenerative future that we're all hoping for. And only then do we even stand a remote chance of getting there, I think.
Totally, mate. And something just popped into my mind, which I hadn't kind of thought about. Well, I'd thought about it, but individually, that 3 people who are friends of Reunion in one way or another spent a week as the crisis actually hit in meditation. These 3 people don't know each other, by the way, as far as I'm aware. And that's pretty interesting, right? And it's kind of like, it would be great if everyone thought in emerging terms, like, oh, this is an emerging thing. We can't give you B. We can't give you A from A to B because no one really knows, but we can give you a path that we can potentially go on. But there needs to be some degree of pause. There needs to be some degree of like, okay, we're here. Whether that's your meditation practice, whether that's getting out into nature where you can. And I think just listening to you speak, it's almost like the new way of working is just to, like we did with our last get together, is have a whole period of pause, and that everyone can kind of get behind. And I know we're in reactionary mode, but maybe it's not whole days or whole weeks, but pausing at the moment just to go, to breathe out, I think could be one of the most important things for us to expand during the Twilight Zone. I think Twilight Zone is an interesting thing to layer over that theory of the luminaries and the trailblazers, and from benefit mindset, right? So how can we be luminaries during the Twilight Zone, and how can we pause together and then move forward from that place?
Yeah, I love that. And I think what is also coming up for me in that is, in this Twilight Zone, just even the name of it, like it was literally a show that I grew up with, of sort of like weird, spooky stuff that happens. And then that's bringing in some of the, things that, that's been coming up with John Vervaeke and Jordan Greenhall, and is bringing some of the mysticism back into this, and that it's going to be an important key to how we solve this, because it isn't just all serious design. We've got to design our ways out of this, and like policy settings and everything. That's part of what got us here. So much of that is it's too cumbersome and it's not fast enough, and a lot of this we're going to have to feel our way through it, through instinct, through insight. And meditation is a part of that. And even sort of for me, like my dreams have come back online and are a massive part of my life as a kid and as a teenager in my 20s, which is in the last week or so, they've come back online as a real sense-making sort of psycho technology for me. Like last night, I know other people's dreams are boring, but it was completely abstract. It was literally, and we've been talking about mosaics, bringing things together as a mosaic, but it was that layered onto the fact that I'm feeling separated, and we are human creatures, and I am social, and I love contact, and I'm feeling very isolated, and I'm in a cell. And if you're thinking of a mosaic, maybe a tile mosaic, you've got the tile with the grout around it. And that's what I feel like at the moment. We're all these little cells, and we're all sort of separated at the moment. And I'm really sort of feeling that there's a lot of compartmentalization going on. And it really helped just waking up with that. It helped me on a way that is almost psychedelic, in a way of kind of insight, and they talk about an awakening that you can't explain. If you have that in meditation, that you can't explain it using words. There is a sense of knowing where words fail us. And we've lost touch with that. And I think it's, ecology of practice that puts us back in touch with that. We had it in nature. Plant medicine and psychedelics put us back in touch with that. I've heard some, I'm in Mullumbimby, but there's been a lot of conversations that I've been listening in when I have gone out on my missions, with people talking about microdosing psilocybin to sort of, retreating back to some plant medicine to sort of reconnect with what is going on. And I think whatever psychotechnology you're using, or ecology of practice, finding space for that in this, or now actually for many people, it will literally be creating space for that. Introduce it, like it's probably weird meditating, or it's probably weird or impossible to meditate for half an hour in the middle of the day in your office environment. You can go and do that now. That's something that I've always found to be, we talk about doing a yoga nidra, just lying, it's a massive, some people might call it a productivity hack. I've actually sort of found it like a real ecology of practice, to actually go and lie down in bed for sort of 20 minutes and doing a yoga nidra and waking up feeling refreshed and going into it with intention, and coming back and feeling that I can tackle a problem with a lot more insight. And I think, that's where those kind of practices, and experimenting with some of those kind of practices, and creating space for that, will bring in this idea of knowing that is not what you learn at university. It's not what you're going to read from a book. It's not what you're necessarily going to pick up from your ecology of practice. So your ecology of information, no matter how high quality it is. Creating space for that little whisper, that hunch, that gut feel. Creating the space for you to cultivate it, but at the same time for you to have the headspace and the mindfulness to actually notice it when it is talking to you. Because we all have that chatter going on up there, spinning around, and those external demands coming down on us. I think that is a massive opportunity that was, that is something you can absolutely cultivate in lockdown, or many of us can anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's like such a perfect way to wrap up this conversation, because as we know, we can just chat forever, especially Absolutely. On frothy topics, even though these ones are a bit gnarlier than usual. And just to caveat, because I know gnarly can be used in a positive way and a negative way, so I'm just going to throw that one out there. But so I guess the message here is, if you want to have a little bit more of a deeper dive into these things, to come play with us. We're launching the second iteration of our Rise Up program, and that'll be starting on Wednesday. So I've got to get this podcast out. Mate, any final words for people before we sign off?
Yeah, no, I would just say, I imagine you're going to put a little super down here, which will sort of have the link.
To, somewhere here.
Just go in there and check it out. If you have any questions, then shoot it through. We're happy to even sort of jump on board and sort of have a chat with you. It is by donation, so we appreciate that that people are in different stages of whether some people might be out of work, or just in unstable work. Some people might be absolutely fine. So we leave it up to you in terms of donation. If you would still like to get involved, then we are running scholarships, so you can just shoot us an email. But I suppose one thing I will sign off on, and it's something that you'll see in some of the testimonials there, and it's something that I get so much from, and I've learned so much from, is this kind of sense of community that we've had off the back of it. We've got a bunch of legends that we're doing weekly catch-ups with that have spun out some truly amazing projects off the back of it. Some of them were already working on them, but then have, jumped into them with renewed vigor. But that really sort of gives, almost like that kindred community that we we're talking about before, where if you're sort of maybe sort of feeling like you've got a lot to offer, you're feeling a little bit stuck, whether it is through, your own internal sort of value sets, whether it is through your information ecology or your ecology of practice, or you're just stuck in as far as where you've, how can you show up in the world? Our theory of change sort of walks everybody through that, and in a really, I suppose, safe and kind of playful and emergent way that just will hopefully sort of help you cultivate some of those things and help you grow sprout like a massive, beautiful sunflower at the other side.
Yeah, awesome, mate. Such a privilege and pleasure to chat with you. There's a term I throw around a bit, which is mentor. Remember, I asked you a couple of years ago, would you be my mentor? And you were like, yeah, dude, that sounds sweet. I'm learning as much off you and I was like, fuck, well, that's a mentor, right? It's your friend that you can learn off, and there's a reciprocal exchange. So much gratitude, dude. And I'm absolutely next week, and I'm frothing for the future.
Quick one, guys. To keep this show afloat, feel free to subscribe and share the love. Maybe even leave a cheeky comment review. That'd be awesome. You can find the show notes on my website at bennywallington.com. And finally, this episode was sponsored by my grandma, Joyce Reichel, who passed away last year from dementia. She was one of the original frothers and would talk to anyone on the bus, train, or wherever, and generously impart her energy and wisdom. So if you see an elderly person who is looking for someone to froth with, go and hang out with them. They've got the best stories. Also, a huge shout out to our producer, Lily Haynes, for bringing this to life, and Billy Otto, who created that beautiful introduction in true Billy Otto style. Also, my buddies in Australia and the UK who have been super generous in swinging me feedback. In a way, all of you guys are sponsoring me with your time. Love to the guests, past and future, and also to you guys for listening. Ciao for now. You!